so much. Thank you so much. Good data points, only 2 of them were wrong. One, I did go to GW and had a 4.0, but A- is still counted as a 4 there, so it was a little bit of a scammy. And I got rid of the vineyard about 3 years ago. How do you make a small fortune in the wine industry? Start with a big fortune. So sorry about being late. It is great to be back in front of the Data Coalition. You know, you are my people. You know, we are the few, the chosen, the people who actually care about data and facts, which is very rare at the place I work these days. You know, I remember last year when we had this summit on the Hill and we were celebrating the passage of the Data Act. It is kind of remarkable to think, you know, I've been in this job 6 years. One of the things that was not mentioned when I was governor, we got recognized as best managed state, best state for business. A lot of that was trying to drive data-driven decisions into the Commonwealth of Virginia's government. So I remember when I first got here elected to the federal level, and my thanks to all of you inside the federal government who are fighting this fight as well day in and day out. A particular thanks to you because you guys really are on the front line, but saying, all right, how do you bring management and budget ideas to the federal enterprise? What became evident to me very quickly was that every president talks about it, but this always becomes a priority that slowly slides down the path. So we started with the GIPRA bill, which, you know, frankly said to agencies, not only do you have to identify your most successful programs, but your least successful programs. I often call that the most important little bill that nobody's heard of. And again, for you in the federal government side, and also trying to limit the priorities. Anybody who knows if you've got 25 priorities, and let's face it, many of them imposed by us in Congress, it's hard to have priorities and goals. And how do we set up a set of measure and metrics to make that work in an appropriate fashion? We got that done. I also remember about 5 years ago, and I pride myself on on being bipartisan, but I did get a few raised eyebrows when I said, no, I want to go meet Darrell Issa and talk about data. And this started, because I know Darrell had been active in this field. He's got a business background as well. And to think that what was happening 5 years ago took that long to get now passage last year of the data bill. The notion that we have so many hundreds of different financial reporting systems inside the federal government just doesn't make much sense. And you know, the good news is obviously we've passed the bill, we passed the legislation. With your help, we're in the process of implementing. I'm going to make my comments different from these very well-prepared remarks that were here that would have basically repeated a lot of stuff that you all know. But there are a couple things we need to be cautious of and vigilant on, perhaps most importantly going forward. First, data bill is a great framework, a great first step. It does not do all the things where I hope we will end up being in terms of transparency and common standards, but it is a great first step. But to do that, we've got to fund the implementation. So the fact that the president put $85 million in that budget, one of the things I've got to do is now try to keep on the appropriators to make sure that that money is spent. You know, one of the hardest things I think in government is whether it's on IT or data or other things, spend on the front end to save down the path. We always are robbing those investments to pay for current expenditures. That is not a rational way to run an enterprise, particularly an enterprise. The one number I thought you were going to mention was $18.5 trillion, which is our current debt number. That's not the way to run this enterprise. So we have to deal with making sure we're funded. And part of that is going to be extraordinarily difficult, just as, again, as a marker, if we continue the stupidity of sequestration. Remember, sequestration was set up to be so stupid that no rational people would let it happen. Memo to future Congresses, don't put the stupid option as a default option because we might just do it again. But if we, you know, and we have to solve sequestration on both the defense side and the discretionary side if we're going to get it work. But that funding on making sure that we have the ability, particularly inside Treasury, to continue this effort is terribly important, number one. Number two, one of the things that People had always asked me, as being a former governor, what's the difference between being a governor and a senator? In many ways, a legislator feels like his or her job is done once the bill is signed. A governor realizes, or somebody in the executive agencies realize, that's just the beginning. And how you implement legislation, how you follow through, is every bit as important, if not more important, than what actually the words of the law said. And so the one thing I want to commit to work with you on is to make sure that we keep both the pressure on and the oversight on to make sure that data is fully implemented. And I want to give a shout out to Amy Edwards, who Treasury stole from me to go work on the implementation. I've had a couple sessions personally with the team from Treasury and OMB, and I have to tell you, I'm pretty pleased, and I'm not easily pleased. But in terms of the progress we've made, some of the standards, some of the codes that we'd had that goal of May, they seem they'll be hitting that. But it's going to require me, from the legislative standpoint, and people like Rob Portman and Darrell Issa and others, both houses, both parties, to continue to stay focused on implementation. It's also going to require you all, and Caitlin, raise your hand. This is the Amy Edwards wannabe replacement, who's doing a great job. But we are wide open for business in my office in terms of being kept informed on how data implementation is going forward. So if you see things, if you don't think we're making enough progress, if you think, and I say this lovingly to our friends in the administration, that it's happening on the schedule that we want it to happen, let us know. And one of the things that we've done in the past when Amy was working with me was I'd had a regular roundtable with some of the CTOs from some of the larger agencies. I need to restart that so I can hear from you on the front end and from people within the actual agencies on implementation on how we get that right. We are seeing, though, already, I think, the possibilities of what we can do with this data. There was a piece of legislation that we passed recently that I partnered with a fellow Virginian, Rob Whitman, from Republican House member, that said, building off of some of the standards that were being created by data, how can we look, and this is really where I want us to end up, how can we look cross-budget, cross-program, state, federal, local, on an area like the Chesapeake Bay? And how can we really make sure, using science, not using political shrillness, as a way to measure the effectiveness of, we've got a host of programs. I've got personal interest. I obviously live in Virginia. Those grapes that I did have for a while are on the Rappahannock River. But how do we make sure the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which has got literally north of about 30 programs, state, federal, and local, how to make sure these programs are actually being used and implemented and the dollars spent in the most effective and efficient way. So this could be a beta test for what I'd hope we could do beyond just trying to get data implemented correctly. Because let's face it, data bill is going to start with financial systems, but it doesn't mean we're going to have that single financial transparency system all across the federal government. It really is just a first step. Last two comments I'll make before we get to the question period is, one, this is, I know I am preaching to the converted, but in an age where entitlements on one hand is squeezing out investments in other parts of our government, and we've refused to reform our tax code in a way to generate more revenue so that we can actually pay for things that need to be paid for, like research, education, infrastructure, we are going to be, no matter who's in charge, I think, in challenging fiscal times on the public sector side for foreseeable future. So really, we need this data so that policymakers can make smarter decisions. This really is going to become, I think, a more and more critical tool of how we govern and how we govern effectively and efficiently in a time when we just aren't going to have the ability, and I'm not sure we've, at least on the domestic discretionary side, had this in a long time, the ability to simply throw money without measuring results. So I really, really need your help in this. The other 2 points I want to raise before we go to questions are, one of the next things that I want to take on is how we can better utilize, and if this will take legislation or nudging, how we better utilize big data, particularly government data, and in a way that, again, recognizing incredibly important privacy protections that have to be guaranteed, but how do we use this enormous accumulation of data that we've got right now in a way that can be monetized, be used for better policy, be used for better decision making. You know, let me give you, I was on a panel last week. I've been very active recently in the so-called gig economy or sharing economy, on-demand economy. I hope you're going to ask a question. I'm going to riff on that for a moment. But, you know, DOL, and these numbers may be slightly off. Anybody here from Department of Labor? Okay, you can correct me if my number's wrong. But I think the order of magnitude's right. Department of Labor has approximately 900 codes on how we rank people based on types of employment. You know, LinkedIn uses 57,000 variables. So, you know, getting more data out in public-private type of arrangements so that we can, particularly in the job placement space, if we can take somebody's period of unemployment from 2 months to 1 month, if we can match somebody's skills, even if they don't have a traditional college education, to a job opening, what we can do in terms of economic opportunity, economic growth is huge. And quite honestly, the balance has shifted away in many times from the feds having all this data, although we do have great data. We ought to be able to figure out ways to share it more. The flip side of that obviously goes into the privacy question, but also goes into the question around data breach and data security. I sit on the Intel committee, and the recent OMB breach, or not OMB, but OPM breach, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. This is an enormously challenging issue, and again, an area in the land of sequestration, doing the kind of data protections at a governmental agency, you know, ends up getting squeezed out because you got to maintain your basic operating purposes. And this data security issue is going to only exponentially grow. I completely agree with Director Comey of the FBI, who said, not only on the .gov side, but particularly on the .com side, you know, there are two types of companies in America: those who've known they've been hacked by the Chinese, and those who don't know they've been hacked by the Chinese, but they have been hacked by the Chinese. And it is way past the time that we find some better ability for information sharing and really step up this issue to a much higher priority. We're debating the defense authorization bill right now. It's terribly important that we get that right. But it is a national security threat when we have, dismiss for a moment the individual's data who was lost, but when we have estimates of close to $100 billion a year in intellectual property being stolen by cyber activities. And those of us, again, on the public side, are going to really have to elevate this in a way that hasn't been elevated to date and collaborate with our private sector partners. There need to be safe havens. There need to be that single point of entry so that we can get it right. Last point before we move to questions is that I'll end with where I started. I can't imagine, I'm getting the cue cards already, I can't imagine that in 2014, it took until 2014 to even have the federal government start thinking about consolidating to a single financial data reporting system. That's the bad news. The good news is we have passed that legislation. I think we've got an administration that is committed at Treasury and OMB to get it done. But this is not going to be done by the end of this administration. It's going to have to continue into whoever is the next administration. And those of you on the front lines, you know, we're going to need your help, focus, and attention. And I hope you will continue to treat me as an ally, supporter, and advocate for making sure that what you do stays at a top priority of your respective agency or administration and not something that gets lost in the shuffle. It's critically, critically important. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to move to questions. Thank you.
All right, is this one on? Oh, great. So raise your hand if you have questions. We have a mic runner. Where's our mic runner? Oh, Hudson is our Vanna White mic runner. Here we go. Here you go, Senator. So as I'm going to ask a question. Raise your hand in the back if you have one. Just kind of broader question. I know data act's a high priority for you, but what other kind of big items are you working on? The gig economy sounds fascinating. I also would love to hear your take on public service. The company I run, GovLoop's an online community for public servants, and public servants just get beat up in the media day after day. But we need a efficient, well-run government. We need great employees, and lots of them are in the audience. So thoughts on both those questions?
Great. Thank you for both of them. Let me start with the short comments. And Tom Friedman wrote a little bit about it in his column today. How many of you have even heard of the gig economy? Raise your hand. Gig economy. Keep your hand up if you've heard of sharing economy or on-demand economy. Here's a remarkable thing. In many ways, I hadn't really thought through this until the last 6 or 7 months. The gig economy, on-demand economy, sharing economy, 1099 economy, people haven't settled on a common phrase, but this is somewhere on the low end, 5 to 10 million workers, on the high end, 53 million workers, a third of America's workforce. What does it mean? It means it's basically contingent workers. This includes people who work full-time, those of you federal government or otherwise, and they maybe have a part-time job on the side. It includes people who for years had to cobble together 2 and 3 and 4 jobs to make a living. But it increasingly includes a whole group of people who by choice are saying, I'm not going to work in a traditional job. I'm going to be an Uber driver and rent out my home on a regular basis through Airbnb, which, by the way, already has more rooms than Marriott. Think about that for a minute. It didn't even exist 5 years ago. You might be an Etsy person. You might be a TaskRabbit. You might be an IT consultant, but you are cobbling together 3 or 4 different revenue streams to make your living. Increasingly amongst the millennials, 80 million strong, I'm a baby boomer, we are yesterday's news. The 80 million millennials who've started work post-2000 kind of come to work in a fairly funky period, 9/11, wars, the recession, are approaching work in a very fundamentally different way. I mean, if our parents' generation had the idea you work for one place, federal government or a company for 40 years, and you got a pension, you got benefits, and maybe you didn't make a bunch of money, but you had that security. You had a defined benefit plan. My generation, has got some of those benefits, but more than likely we move from defined benefit to defined contribution. A much more tailored, we're kind of the 401k generation. This next millennial generation is walking on this type wire with no safety net at all underneath. It has huge policy questions. 25 people running for president, nobody's talked about this. This contingent workforce or gig economy doesn't pay unemployment, doesn't pay workman's comp. They don't have a 1099, they're not even paying into Social Security. And they may be making 100 grand a year, 150 grand a year. There are people I've met and talked to who are doing this. But if the stuff hits the fan, as it always does at some point, they go from here down to poverty programs with nothing catching them in between. Now, I'm not saying the old models are going to work, but I am saying that we ought to have a conversation about what that future safety net looks like. Is it a healthcare exchange model for workman's comp? Is it an hour bank model that the building trades unions used to use? Is it a consumer-driven model where you say, on your Uber, I'm going to give a tip of 5 or 10%, and that's not going to go to the driver, it's going to go into a social insurance fund? I don't know the answer for sure. But we sure as heck need to be starting to think about this, because the one thing I am sure of is that this acceleration of change and this disaggregation, partially driven by data, between a traditional employer and employee is really fundamentally changing. Last point I'll make before we and touch on public service as well, is that I was talking to the CEO of Airbnb the other day, and he had for those of us who are older like me, take a moment to wrap your head around this. He basically said his parents' generation, their definition of American success was own a house, have 2 cars, send your kids to college, and maybe, just maybe, if you did really well, get a little cottage at the lake. But the millennial generation has got a completely different mindset than ownership. They have sharing. They don't want to own a car, they want to share a car. They don't mind sharing living space. They don't mind, they want to collect experiences that they can use on their Instagram. They want to keep their data. They want to have a good online reputation. If that continues, we have a whole tax and policy network that's set up towards ownership, when maybe the next group of millennials have a different mindset of what success is going to be. The point here is I don't know the answer, but we ought to be having this conversation. Last point is the public service question. I think nothing makes me angrier than to see people that I work with day in and day out come down and trash the federal workforce. You know, I went into public service because I think it is a noble calling. I think anybody that works for the federal government or state government or local government, you are a public servant. And you ought to be rewarded and recognized and acknowledged. I think it is also just plain stupid management technique to say, we're going to cut you and then we're going to blame you. That is not incentives to do more with less. So what I try to do on a regular basis, not as much as I should, I did a lot the first couple of years, so about once a month go down and recognize a great federal employee, somebody nobody's heard of, but just somebody who's done something. And we need to, I and others need to do more of that because quite honestly, you who work in the federal government, if we don't change this attitude, so many of you are kind of my age, I'm a baby boomer, where's the next generation going to be? We are not going to do well in our country if this next generation of millennials, who are the most diverse, most educated, most open to disruptive change, and actually on the good news side, want to work for and buy from socially responsible companies and entities, if they don't see the federal government, state government, or local government as a valid and valuable employment route, then our country's not going to have the same kind of quality and opportunity we've had in the past. So I think it's very, very important that we stay focused on this.
Great. Time for questions. We got the first in the back. Oh, it's in the back in the tan suit. Quick rules. One question. Go quick and no 2-minute monologues.
Why aren't state and local governments implementing Data Act type of legislation? The NCSL, GASB, they seem to be really behind on this. And it's just not economies of scale. Small countries like Estonia, Singapore, and South Korea are leading innovators. Why can't we do this at the local and state level? Catch up.
I'd have a really great answer to that if I was still governor. No, I think the thing is, I think this notion of, I can tell you from the Virginia state government, we did pretty well. But I don't think I'd ever done the analysis of how many different data reporting systems we had. I remember when I first became governor, it took me $1 million of outside contractual help to figure out how much we were spending on IT. So obviously we didn't have great records if we didn't know how much we were spending on IT, which was about $900 million a year. I think this whole area of data transparency, usage of big data, is relatively new. I'm actually surprised by your comment that there's not some state that hasn't tried to put a stake in the ground and said, we're going to be the leader in this. I'll call Governor McAuliffe this afternoon and rib him on this, but I think it is something that if the Federal Data Act is going to work, if the Chesapeake Bay Act that I talked about earlier is going to really compare cross-cutting programs, those are programs that are implemented with state and local dollars as well. You got to have that. You got to have that interoperability, using an old telecom term, between these systems. So I think it's a good point, and I ought to give you a better answer.
Great. Other questions from the audience? We'll go up front. And actually, it's interesting on the Data Act, while many states aren't doing a lot of work yet, there is a big movement in the open data field. So, state of Illinois and other states are putting a lot of their data out at the state level, maybe not at the level of what we'd hope out of the Data Act, but there are some movements going.
And I'm not sure, again, I can't, as a former governor, I should be able to better answer this, but, it blew me away when I found out that within just the DOD, there were 250 different financial reporting systems. I'm not sure inside, VDOT, there were 200 different financial reporting systems, but there might have been 10 or 20. I don't know. That's a great, I'm going to get you an answer, better answer than I gave you.
Last question.
Sure, Senator Warner, Alex Howard here from the Huffington Post. It's good to see you again. I see this IRS Git transcript compromise, and that was one.
Say again, I'm sorry.
The IRS Git transcript compromise. The IRS set up this service that allowed millions of Americans to download their tax transcript, and I think 26 million people did. But then people used basically stolen information elsewhere to be able to get access, and stole people's information, and then were able to file fraudulent returns. Are you watching what the IRS is doing around identity management so that people can get access to their personal data? And to that point, how will Americans be able to see what the government knows about them in terms of open data and see it themselves in the way we can, say, look at credit reports?
It's always that last question. Especially the guy
I should
with
have
the
picked
camera.
someone else. so.
Especially the guy with the camera. One, I think it's a very fair question. It is one where I've focused has been on the fact that with the amount of data theft that's going on, or the identity theft that's going on, people, and it happened to my dad, people filing false returns early to the IRS, and the IRS sending out the check before the employer sends in the actual employment information, which, you know, I've got a bill actually with Ron Johnson to try to change that. My hope is IRS has been telling me they're changing their processing here, but IRS really needs to make more dramatic changes. The fact that IRS does not have a IT system that would kick somebody out if they happen to be 120 years old, that maybe we ought to check and see if that person's alive, is a sign that not as all well there. And you know, we have had, you know, this gets kind of into the whole federal IT procurement process, which I tried to learn a while back, but by no means have mastered, other than the fact that we need reform, but because you constantly hear of IT reforms at the IRS that don't get fully implemented. I do think sometimes this has been lack of focus, and often IT is the first thing cut in any kind of budget downturn, which is, you know, the opposite of what I think would happen on the private sector side. The bigger question, I had somebody at a town hall meeting last night saying, you know, I don't want to give my Social Security number to anybody. Why does this private company want my Social Security number? And yet she then went on to say she had 3 other people that she knew that had exactly her same name. Well, if you've got exactly the same name and you're only using name instead of Social Security, you got to have some kind of unique identifier. So I think this area of how you can in effect Google yourself to find out what the government has on you, I think is a valid question that needs to be answered. And I don't have I think that's where we need to head. But I also know that the idea that many companies have started to use that say, okay, we're going to be encrypted on both ends and we're going to have data disappear, and you know, in a very, very dangerous world, raises a whole host of questions as well. And I think you're going to increasingly see a lot of people who've been on the provider side and the telco-related side say they're starting to see some of the bad actors are using the system. This is a brave new world of challenges. And you know, I know we just did the USA Freedom Act, but the idea that the USA Freedom Act that as somebody who used to be in the telco business, that somehow our data is going to be a lot safer being with telcos at 20 different locations than with certain people who are sworn to protect our security, NSA. You can argue either side. I might trust NSA more than I trust 20 telcos.
A quick question specific. So one of the ways that we give open data to veterans is through the Blue button, right? You can make a personal health record, you can download, it's machine interoperable, you're supposed to be able to carry it from place to place. So a veteran gets carried one place, can bring the record with them to another. Pretty cool. You can do it. Your parents right now, Aetna now accepts it. But to get someone's personal health data over the internet, you want to encrypt that, right? So aren't there some places that we do want encryption?
I do think we're going to need, in certain places, encryption. You know, how we do that in a way that is still accessible and user-friendly to users and citizens as well is something we have to sort through. I mean, you know, let me give you, again, not a direct answer, so as I speak to your tape there, in the land of digital, all things will and live forever. But, you know, let me give you some more on the financial sector side, which I've been pushing, that I think is kind of low-hanging fruit. You know, we're the only industrial nation in the world that hasn't used chip and pin on our credit cards. You know, why is that good that's dramatically cut down on credit card theft and identity theft in the rest of the world that we haven't implemented here? We still have chip and signature. You know, and frankly, the bank's idea is that, well, Americans can't remember their PIN numbers is not a very good answer in terms of failure to implement it. But I think there's going to, you know, I think this is going to require thoughtful policy analysis that doesn't leap to either extreme. It's going to require continuing to upgrade tools, whether they are encryption or otherwise. It is going to require a fuller explanation Again, I take USA Freedom Act as an example. I understand why Americans may feel more comfortable with data at telcos, but the idea that telcos are really going to keep that more private than people who are, Mr. Snowden was not an employee of the NSA, he was a contractor, then what happened to the NSA, I think is an argument that should have actually been more thoroughly debated than it was on the floor of the Senate. We may give the illusion of greater privacy protections, but I'm not sure, again, somebody who was in the telecom business for a long time, and as the co-founder of Nextel has been mentioned, I'm also the only politician that says, and I can't criticize you for this, even when I'm talking, leave your cell phones on. But it's going to take a more sophisticated debate. And last point is, I do think we need to pass the cyber legislation. What we have right now is we don't even have that single portal of entry where if you're on the private side, who do you report to? What are the standards if you got a data breach on how quickly you ought to report? This is an area where I think that you can't leave it to 51, counting the district, 51 different jurisdictions to figure that out. We're going to need some standards here. And it is going to be a robust debate, but it's time to come. When we spend all this time on defense authorization, and yet we've got, again, estimates of $100 billion a year of intellectual property being stolen, and nobody's thinking about that very much, that is not the right allocation of time, energy, and resources going forward. But end of the day, this is, I got to head back to my day job, but thank you all for what you have done and what you will hopefully continue to do. Data is only the first step. We've got to get it funded. We've got to make sure the implementation, and we've got to look at Data Act 2.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your leadership. Round of applause for Senator.